One August morning in 1942, under a pale, cold sky, a fleet of small ships and landing craft pushed toward a French port the Germans believed secure. What happened there, in a few brutal hours of confusion and courage, would shock both sides, rewrite amphibious doctrine, and haunt commanders for months afterwards. This was not a parade of victory. It was a lesson carved in blood that, paradoxically, helped make the greatest invasion of all possible months later. I'm Dan Snow, and this is the story of an extraordinary raid that changed the course of planning for the Allies and forced German commanders to reassess everything they thought they knew about defending a coastline. Imagine the scene: dawn light struggling through mist, a pebble beach rimed with seawater, concrete bunkers frowning down from the cliffs. Small groups of soldiers, fresh from training and briefings, climbed into the ramped hulls of landing craft. On board were men who had never fought together as a single unit, tanks meant for beaches that were never tested on pebbles, and an Air Force and Navy hoping against the odds to suppress well-entrenched defenders. The plan was ambitious: hit a fortified port, destroy key installations, seize documents, capture prisoners, and return before the enemy could organize a coherent counterattack. It sounds almost theatrical. In practice, it was chaotic and, for many of those who took part, devastating. If this opening image grabs you, stick with me, and if you care about how daring small operations can ripple up to strategic consequence, hit subscribe. There are few episodes in the middle years of the Second World War that teaches plainly about the gap between tactical courage and strategic reality. To understand why a single raid could matter so much, we need to meet a man who loomed over any discussion of coastal defense in 1944, Erwin Rommel. He was not in France when the raid took place in 1942. In fact, at that moment, he was proving in the deserts of North Africa that war had changed, that mobility and imagination could outwit rigid doctrines. Yet by 1944, the figure of the desert fox, Rommel, cast a long shadow over the Atlantic coast, and the memory of earlier Allied probes helped shape his thinking. Rommel's rise was in many ways a textbook of modern celebrity in wartime. A competent, decorated veteran of the First World War, he won fresh renown commanding the Africa Corps from 1941 to 1943. He was a commander who preferred to be at the sharp edge, scouting positions, pushing troops to improvise, rewarding initiative. The nickname Desert Fox owes as much to his willingness to take personal risks and to the machinery of propaganda that resurrected a style of soldierly heroism the regime wanted to show the German people. But that propaganda should not blind us. Rommel's tactical flair was real.
He had an instinct for terrain, for surprise, for combining armor and infantry in ways that repeatedly frustrated his opponents in North Africa. Equally real was the darker frame within which he operated. Rommel served a criminal regime. Praising his tactical mind is not the same as excusing the wider evil of Nazism. By the time the Allies began planning major operations across the Channel, Rommel had been set the task, reluctantly accepted and energetically pursued, of transforming the Atlantic beaches into a fortress. He believed the invasion could and should be stopped at the waterline. He argued for mines, obstacles, coastal artillery, and a doctrine that forced invaders to face annihilation the moment boots touched sand. He wanted concrete and barbed wire and obstacles that ripped the first wave to pieces. Whether one sees this as stern realism or tragic fatalism depends greatly on interpretation. Historians debate how far Rommel's proposals were feasible given German industrial limits and the strategic picture. The Germans, meanwhile, were operating on a different set of assumptions. The occupied coast was long, the resources thin. Hitler's obsession with grand mobile counterattacks sometimes clashed with Rommel's more immediate, localized approach. And Allied deception campaigns, formal operations designed to convince German high command of false intentions, were already at work. The Allies understood the power of misdirection. Operation Fortitude, for example, would later convince German planners that the main invasion would fall not at Normandy, but at a different, more northerly point. Even so, small-scale raids and probes had a dual effect. They tested the enemy and forced them to respond in ways that could be exploited strategically. The raid I want to focus on, one of the most talked-about amphibious expeditions of the Middle War, took place on a summer morning in 1942 and bore an official name that sounds innocuous: Operation Jubilee. To most of the men who landed, it was simply Dieppe. The planners conceived Dieppe as a sharp, violent experiment. The hope was to strike quickly, seize the port installations, gather useful intelligence, and then get out before the Germans could mount a full-scale defense. The greater purpose, some argued, was to shake the Germans, to test their resolve, and to learn lessons about assaulting fortified coastlines. In the months leading up to Dieppe, the Allied command structure wrestled with the hard realities of amphibious warfare. Britain was a nation built on islands, but the experience of mounting large-scale, integrated amphibious attacks was incomplete. There had been raids, raids within raids, commando operations, and special forces tests. But a full-scale combined assault, with infantry, armor, air support, and naval gunfire operating in a tight choreography, remained perilous and improvisatory.
The people planning Dieppe believed a sharp, concentrated blow might pay huge dividends in knowledge. What they did not know, many of them, was how devastatingly the assumptions of planning could be undone by the tangle of cliffs, seawalls, and German firepower awaiting them. The Canadian Army furnished a large portion of the assault force. For many Canadian units, Dieppe would be their baptism by fire into the broad, brutal, personal cost of amphibious operations. They had trained, rehearsed, and been briefed, yet training in lakes and on beaches was no substitute for confronting concrete pillboxes and flanking machine gun fire. The operation also included British Army commando units, RAF squadrons providing air cover, and a Navy tasked with bombardment and transport. The idea was to synchronize these elements. In the plan, surprise and speed would be the allies of a numerically modest force striking a well-defended point. At dawn, the landing craft nosed in toward a coastline shelled by concrete and wired with obstacles. The pebbled beach that protected the port offered no cover. The cliffs that flanked it gave defenders fields of fire that were brutally effective. Tanks designed for soft, sandier approaches struggled on the stones. Some stalled or drowned as the surf rose. Machine guns sighted to sweep any line of approach turned the open beach into what many participants later described as a killing ground. Small units found themselves pinned, with commanders killed or cut off, without the full integration of naval gunfire and air suppression they had been promised. The air battle overhead was close and costly. The RAF fought hard to keep German fighters and reconnaissance down and to destroy coastal batteries, but getting adequate and sustained close air support into the exact points where ground troops needed it, while also trying to suppress beach defenses, proved extremely difficult. The Navy, constrained by the need to keep ships out of the arc of coastal guns and the risk of mines, could not always bring its heavy guns to bear on the bunkers framed by the cliffs. Communication between services in the heat of battle fractured in ways rehearsals on English beaches had not exposed. From the German perspective, the defenders were not naive or unprepared. Units of infantry, supported by coastal artillery and machine guns, had also been studying the approaches, practicing their fields of fire and the employment of obstacles. Commanders on the ground reacted swiftly. Reinforcements, routed by precise radio communications and a disciplined reserve system, flooded into key points and cut off routes of withdrawal. The port itself proved harder to seize than planners had imagined. Heavy gates, anti-tank obstacles, and cleverly sited emplacements made a quick seizure impractical once the tide and the enemy's response combined against the attackers.
Those who broke through into the town, a small, winding place with streets that quickly turned into avenues of danger, paid dearly. Urban fighting without guaranteed close support is merciless. Men who had trained to assault beaches found themselves ambushed among narrow alleys, hemmed in by buildings and fired on from above. Extraction under fire, even when boats returned to collect survivors, became a nightmare of confusion and loss. By late afternoon, the order to withdraw was given. Boats came back under withering fire. Many could not approach the beach for the same reasons they had been hampered at first. Men clambered up ramps into craft while artillery and machine gun bullets stitched the water. Ships and aircraft worked to cover the retreat, but the cost was severe. Landing units were left on the beach, tanks were abandoned, and many were taken prisoner. The scene of evacuation was as grim as the landings had been daring. Flattened faces, empty rifle belts, and small, torn unit standards. Why then, you might ask, is a raid that inflicted such heavy casualties on the attackers described as extraordinary? Because in the immediate aftermath, even as commanders in London and Ottawa and the Canadian rear ranks wept over the human toll, their strategists took the lesson hard and sharp. They read the map differently. They understood that the risks of a direct frontal assault against fortified ports were too great without certain preconditions. Suppression of coastal batteries by heavy, sustained naval gunfire, reliable close air support to prevent defenders from reinforcing, specialized armored vehicles able to deal with beach obstacles and hedgerows, better intelligence on obstacles and coastal defenses, and a rehearsal of combined operations at assault scale. The human headlines were grim. The material headlines were instructive. Armored design shifted. Tankers experimented with amphibious modifications. Naval doctrine adjusted the use of bombardment and timing. Most importantly, the planners began to conceive of an invasion that would not aim to seize a defended port on day one, but would secure a lodgment,
bring ashore specially adapted armor and engineers, and then move inland to seize key ports once the beachhead was secure. That conceptual shift from a frontal assault on fortress ports to the establishment of a secure beachhead followed by methodical capture of logistics nodes became central to later Allied success. Historians debate the moral calculus of Dieppe. Some argue that it was a needless sacrifice, that the intelligence it yielded could have been obtained by less costly means. Others insist the hard-won lessons were indispensable, that without Dieppe's painful schooling, the Allies might have repeated its mistakes on a far larger scale in 1944. Both views have merit.
What is clear is that for planners in 1943 and early 1944, the memory of the pebble beaches and immobilized tanks was never far from mind when they set down the new rules of amphibious assault. Across the Channel, far from the shattered beaches, German commanders absorbed their own lessons. Probing attacks like Dieppe confirmed fears that the Allies might be bold, imaginative, and willing to pay dearly for a strategic advantage. The curators of the Atlantic defenses, including army officers who would later work with Rommel, re-evaluated the placement of obstacles, the use of coastal artillery, and the speed of reinforcement. Records show heightened alertness along many stretches of coastline in the weeks and months that followed. Whether this translated into the kind of all-encompassing fix Rommel later sought is another matter. Resources and strategic priorities were constantly in tension. For Rommel himself, again, he was geographically distant in 1942, the essence of what Dieppe revealed was familiar but still alarming. Manfred Rommel, his son, later recalled as a personal recollection his father poring over reports and maps, often speaking less of ideology than of practicalities, how armor behaved when it met beachstones, how infantry operated under enfilading fire, and how vital the coordination of sea, air, and land truly was. Manfred's memory is of a father who despised complacency and who, when told of the raid's debacle, worried less about propaganda and more about the immediate lesson. The enemy was learning fast. We had better learn faster. The raid also fed into another, subtler dynamic, the desperate chess game of deception and counter-deception that both sides played. The Allies had already begun to craft an elaborate fig leaf to hide the true focus of their intentions. The idea of feints, of simulated landings, of phantom armies broadcast over wireless channels and fed through double agents would gain in sophistication as 1943 wore on. For the Germans, however, each probe by Allied commandos or raiding parties was evidence that the threat was constant and multifaceted. They had to guard not only against mass landings, but against agile, high-impact incursions that aimed to destroy a single key vulnerability. How much weight to give to each signal from the enemy was a question of scarce resources and high stakes. Back in London, in rooms where maps were lit by lamplight and cigarette smoke, staff officers began to rewrite doctrine. They tested new landing craft designs and evaluated the idea of specialized tanks that could bridge craters, lay fascines, and brush aside obstacles built to prevent a straightforward beach landing. They debated whether to rely on surprise or on overwhelming preliminary bombardment, and how to choreograph air cover that could suppress enemy action at the exact time and place ground forces needed it.
Dieppe's lessons forced the Allies unwillingly into a more careful, technically sophisticated approach to amphibious warfare. Yet, even as planners recalibrated, the personal cost remained front and center. Families received telegrams. Communities mourned. The psychological effect on troops, especially on Canadians who had fought there for the first time on European soil, was profound. The narrative of the raid entered national memory not as a neat textbook case, but as a wound. Veterans' accounts from both sides speak of courage and panic, of small acts of heroism amid larger failures. These are the human details that no doctrine can fully absorb. What the raid did not do, however, was to end Allied attempts at audacity. If anything, the reverse occurred. The lesson, drawn in cold, strategic terms, was that future success would require audacious planning matched with meticulous preparation. That paradox, that a costly failure can sharpen future triumphs, is the bitter arithmetic of wartime learning. And then there is the question of how the raid affected German command decisions at the highest levels. Did it cause a wholesale repositioning of forces? Did it convince men like Rommel that the Atlantic Wall required a different kind of defense? Some of that response was immediate, tactical rearrangement, increased patrols, stronger local defenses, revised arrangements for reserves. But a complete strategic sweep, the kind of total reallocation of forces that would make a decisive difference years later, required resources that Germany increasingly lacked. The Reich's priorities, stretched on multiple fronts, meant that even a clear-eyed commander faced frustrating constraints. As I trace these strands, the men on the beach, the planners in the map room, the generals far from the coast, a picture begins to form of a conflict where a single operation can be both a tragedy and a catalyst. The raid's immediate brutality was plain.
its long-term consequences more structural. It forced new habits of thought. It made some commanders more cautious, others more innovative. It sharpened the will of the Allies to prepare a proper, integrated assault rather than gamble again on a quick strike. But the story does not end on the beach. The memory of that August morning followed men across oceans and desert sands. For Rommel, whose later assignment would be to fashion the Atlantic Wall into something that could stave off invasion, the evidence of Allied audacity shaped his calculations about where the fight might fall and how rigid or loose the defense should be. For planners in London and Washington, the lesson of Dieppe was a clarion call to build something new from the ruins of failure. Vehicles that could handle hedgerows and beach obstacles, unified command procedures that worked under fire, the rehearsing of amphibious assaults at scale, and the acceptance that heavy cost in the present might prevent an even heavier one later.
Even as the analysts and engineers retooled, the memory of that day hardened into a moral and intellectual problem. How do you weigh the immediate loss of life against potential future gains? How do planners, who owe their duty to states and strategies, reconcile the sacrifice of those they command? These questions would not be answered cleanly in the months that followed. In fact, they compound. The raid survivors carried searing impressions of language and landscape that would appear in later testimonies. Men describing tanks floundering on pebble beaches, small arms fire from emplacements carved into the cliff face, the sight of comrades taken prisoner and marched away, the groan of vessels hit as they tried to provide a corridor for retreat. For the German defenders, too, there were impressions. The realization that the enemy could mount a complex combined operation and that the ebb and flow of momentum at sea could turn on small technical details. Both sides learned. Both were changed. At this point in our story, we stand at a crossroads. The raid is over, the immediate accounts are filed, and the casualties counted, but the strategic echo has barely started to resound. In the weeks and months that followed, intelligence reports were pored over, plans rewritten, and engineers set to work devising the tools that would later pierce the Atlantic Wall. High command meetings, some secret, some public, debated whether to change the very nature of amphibious warfare. Rommel, who would later believe that invasion must be stopped on the beaches, had begun to sense, through reports, recollections, and the assessments of subordinates, the ferocity with which the Allies could conduct such operations. He would act on that sense when his turn came to shape the defenses of the French coast. What I want to do next is to follow two lines simultaneously. The operational thread, how the Allies transformed lessons into doctrine, vehicles, and training, and the personal thread, how figures like Rommel, watching from afar, turned those lessons into demands for concrete and mines and flexible defenses. Both matter if we are to appreciate why a single raid, however costly, could have outsized influence on the path to 1944. But first, there are details from the day itself we need to hold close. Not the grand strategy, but the immediate human moments that made the larger story possible. The commando who scrambled over a seawall, the tank commander whose engine choked on stones, the radio operator whose transmission was cut short. These are the small units of experience that built the broader lesson. In multiple later interviews, survivors described a mixture of discipline and bewilderment, of efforts to coordinate that were heroically resolved in small pockets even as the larger plan frayed. On board the ships that night and in the hours before dawn, many men believed in the simplicity of their orders. In, strike, out. That belief was their courage.
The war, however, soon taught them that simplicity could die under the weight of the facts on the ground. For the command structure, Dieppe was a crucible. It distilled the essential requirements of a successful cross-channel assault into a painful checklist. For Rommel and the Germans, it was a warning, a sign that the Allies were willing to probe and pay to learn. The consequences of that willingness would reach far beyond one pebble-strewn beach. It is here, at this hinge between immediate aftermath and long-term consequence, that the real drama of our story begins to accelerate. If we step back now and look at the map of Europe, at the men who would soon be plotting an invasion across the Channel, we see a braid of technical improvisation, doctrinal revision, and political urgency. In the chapters to come, we must examine those braided strands, how Allied planners turned tragedy into innovation, how Rommel, increasingly convinced that his coastline had to be an iron trap, would try to shape events, and how a single raid became, in hindsight, a crucial and contested chapter in the road to D-Day. If Dieppe taught the Allies one thing with absolute clarity, it was this: courage alone would not be enough to force a defended shore. The following months and years were an exercise in translating bitter experience into precise engineered solutions. What emerged was not a single magic fix, but a suite of doctrinal, technical, and organizational changes, innovations born of failure and refined by relentless testing, all aimed at ensuring that when the Allies finally crossed the Channel, they would do so on terms they chose. At the center of that transformation was a stubborn insistence that the elements of an assault had to be married in time and space. Air power would no longer be a separate tool to be thrown at a problem after the fact. Naval gunfire had to arrive early and be able to hit exactly the positions ground troops faced. Armor had to be adapted for unfamiliar conditions. Engineers would become frontline weapons, not merely follow-ons. In Britain and Canada, in Little Admiralty and War Office rooms, men argued late into the night about the practicalities. How do you keep a tank from bogging down on shingle? How do you get a bridge-laying vehicle off a landing craft and into a crater under fire? How do you land engineers and explosives fast enough to clear obstacles and let infantry move inland before the enemy can close the cordon? One of the clearest technological ripostes to the Dieppe lesson was the birth of what came to be known as Hobart's Funnies. Named after Major General Percy Hobart, these were specialist armored vehicles, Churchill tanks and other platforms, modified with a single purpose: to do what regular tanks could not on a defended shore. Some carried bridge sections, others dozers to clear obstacles. Some disgorged fascines, bundles of wood and steel that could be dropped into a ditch to allow vehicles to cross. There were tanks fitted with flame-throwing gear to neutralize pillboxes, and tanks with huge mortars to demolish reinforced positions. Most famously to many viewers of D-Day footage, there were amphibious variants designed to float and propel themselves from ship to shore, though the story of amphibious tanks stretches back before and after Dieppe as engineers and tacticians experimented with the idea. These adaptations were more than technical novelties. They represented a profound rethinking of assault timelines. The goal shifted to securing a lodgement, a beachhead generous enough and deep enough to bring across specialized tools and engineers who could then turn temporary access into sustained supply lines. Taking a defended port on day one ceased to be the lodestar of planning. Instead, the British and Americans invested in mobile supply solutions. Artificial harbours the size of floating cities, the Mulberry harbours, were conceived so that men and materiel could be poured ashore without having to capture a port immediately. Fuel moved from the realm of crisis planning into engineering certainty, with projects like Pluto, the undersea pipeline that was to deliver petrol across the Channel. These were not abstract ideas, they were responses to the brittle realities experienced on the pebble beach at Dieppe. Doctrine also evolved. Combined operations, the choreography of Navy, Army and Air Force, had to be rehearsed at scale. Training went from platoon-level beach practice to full-scale exercises replicating the confusion and friction of live combat. Command and control, communication technologies and timing procedures were overhauled. Call for fire procedures became more detailed. Pre-landing bombardments were recalibrated so as to suppress defenders without inadvertently blinding or disorientating the attacking troops who followed. Intelligence collection intensified. Aerial photography, intercepted communications and coastal reconnaissance all fed into a more granular map of what lay behind each beach and every harbour. Alongside technological and doctrinal reform, deception became doctrine in its own right. If brute force and engineering could solve specific problems, misdirection could solve the distribution of enemy forces. The Allies expanded what had been an ad hoc set of ruses into an all-consuming strategy. Operation Fortitude, itself an evolution of an earlier body of deception work, transformed the channel of information that reached German command. Fake armies were marshalled not in reality but on radio waves and in controlled leaks. Double agents, turned and fed by British intelligence, transmitted believable signals about Allied dispositions. Inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft cluttered fields in South England, visible to any casual reconnaissance. Deceptive radio traffic imitated the maintenance schedules and training chatter of entire divisions that did not exist.
Above all, the Allies sought to create a narrative that would stick. The phantom 1st United States Army Group, commanded by General Patton, would threaten the Pas-de-Calais, and German attention would be drawn there rather than to Normandy. Historians debate the extent to which operations like Dieppe directly accelerated these programs, but the causal logic is clear. A raid that proved the enemy could interdict a landing and make a seizure of a port extraordinarily costly sharpened the incentive to divert attention from the real plan and to buy the initial weeks of an invasion with craft, deception, and surprise. If a frontal assault on a defended port looked perilous, then fooling the enemy about the point of commitment could make all the difference. On the German side of the Channel, that difference was deeply felt. Reports of Dieppe circulated among officers who were already uneasy about the vulnerabilities of their coast. Training patterns changed, patrols lengthened, reserve posture shifted. But the German response was not uniform. There were real structural constraints: shortages of concrete, shortages of steel, competing priorities on multiple fronts. Strategic imperatives in the East and in Italy meant that resources were sliced thin. This, more than anything, complicated the task of men like Erwin Rommel, who by 1944 found himself wrestling not just with tactical choices, but with the political economy of war. Rommel's relationship with the Atlantic Wall is one of the most revealing tensions of the period. To understand him in this role, picture the man who had once been celebrated as a bold, mobile commander in the desert, brooding over maps and blueprints. He came to the Atlantic coast with a practitioner's eye. He walked the beaches, inspected obstacles personally, and demanded that defenses be practical and relentless. For him, the logic was simple and grim. The Allies would try to land. The primary obligation of the defender was to make that landing impossibly costly. This was not mere rhetoric. He pushed for field fortifications, tank traps, hedgehogs, mines, vast belts of barbed wire, underwater obstacles designed to rip out a ship's hull. He wanted the coastline to be an immediate, molten wall of death for anyone attempting to disembark. Yet Rommel was not merely an obsessive builder of barriers, he was a cleaner of illusions. He argued, repeatedly and sometimes bluntly, that Germany could not afford to hold the Channel with insufficient coastal forces unless it committed overwhelming firepower to the beaches themselves. From his angle, reserves in the rear, designed for counterattack, were less valuable than raw firepower in the first moments when attackers are most vulnerable. That view put him in tension with the High Command's penchant for mobile counterattacks and Hitler's own fixation on strategic reserves. The result was a policy friction that would prove crippling when the actual invasion came.
Manfred Rommel's recollections, and here it is important to emphasize that these are recollections, a son's memories shaped by time and grief, paint a picture of a father who was continually frustrated by politics and supply lines. He spoke, according to his son, less in grand strategic theory and more in the language of tools and times. If the beach is a kill zone, he might say in Manfred's memory, you must bring the means to break the kill zone and bring them early. Those were practical injunctions, not declarations of ideology. They were precisely the kind of lessons a man who had seen mobility win battles would advocate when he turned his mind to static defense. Despite Rommel's energy, resources remained the decisive limiter. The Reich's industrial base had been shattered by constant Allied bombing, and material diverted to other theaters could not be easily reallocated overnight. So beach fortifications were a mixture of determined local effort and improvisation. In places where Rommel's visits had occurred, bunkers rose visibly. In other stretches, local commanders did what they could with what they had. These uneven investments would matter horribly in June 1944, when the distribution of German forces across the coast and behind it would determine the speed and shape of the Allied breakout. The Allies, meanwhile, were not just retooling material, they were rewriting scenarios. The idea of a single decisive seizure gave way to a phased conception. The first days would be about securing a relatively narrow but defensible lodgment, holding it against counterattacks, and then expanding outward as heavy equipment and engineering assets arrived. If Dieppe had taught how quickly the enemy could stop a landing force without the proper tools and overwhelming local firepower, the broad concept now incorporated a sequence of operations designed to deny the defender an opportunity to exploit initial chaos. All of this, training, deception, innovation, converged in the run-up to June 1944, when the Allies committed to Operation Overlord. To follow Dieppe's thread into Normandy is to see the interplay between caution and audacity. The invasion required audacity on a scale larger than any previous amphibious operation. Yet that audacity was engineered, rehearsed, tested, and supported by the very changes Dieppe compelled. Mulberry harbors would provide what seizing Cherbourg had not allowed at Dieppe. Hobart's funnies would clear obstacles that had stopped tanks on pebble beaches. Detailed aerial reconnaissance and the air superiority the Allies had won would blunt enemy reinforcement and interdiction. For Rommel, the months immediately before Overlord were a pressure cooker. He inspected the French coast in the spring of 1944, constantly demanding stronger coastal units and more concrete.
Historian debates swirl around his motivations in these months. Was he driven primarily by duty, by an instinct for military perfection, by a desire to protect Germany, or, as some contend,
by a dawning disillusionment with Hitler's strategic decision-making. The safest reading is the one grounded in the evidence we have, a tactician intensely focused on the practicalities of defense, who increasingly clashed with a political leadership that could not or would not meet his demands. Rommel's absence on D-Day has become a focal point in the biographical literature. He was not on the beaches on June 6th, he was at home in Germany on medical leave and, according to certain counts, visiting family. Some historians argue that his absence was avoidable and symptomatic of wider systemic failures. Others note the extraordinary pressures of the moment and the realities of senior command, where one man could not be everywhere at once. What is incontrovertible is that when the invasion came, Rommel's sense of urgency convinced him that the Allies had achieved the lodgment they required to establish a sustained presence in France. Reports filtered across the Channel, and in the days that followed, Rommel was consumed by the need to organize a response he believed should have been prepared. It was in the fraught weeks after D-Day that Rommel's life took a tragic, decisive turn. On July 17, 1944, his staff car was attacked by Allied aircraft while returning from inspecting the front. The vehicle was strafed, and Rommel, alongside other passengers, suffered severe injuries. The wounds left him incapacitated, removed from the front at a moment when German command was descending into chaos. He was evacuated to Germany for treatment. From that point onward, his capacity to influence defense collapsed with his health. The wider political tempest that followed must be handled with care. Historians continue to debate the degree and nature of Rommel's involvement in plots against Hitler. Some correspondence and testimonies suggest sympathetic ties to officers who sought to remove Hitler, yet there is no conclusive evidence that Rommel was a conspirator in the sense of being one of the architects of the 20 July 1944 assassination attempt. What is certain is what happened afterward. In the course of the Gestapo's investigation following the plot, Rommel's name appeared in interrogations and documents. Presented with a stark choice, public trial with the likely humiliation of a show trial and the threat to his family, or death by his own hand in private with the promise of honors and protection for his family, he chose the latter. On October 14, 1944, he ended his life under circumstances orchestrated by the regime. The official story released to the German public cast his death as a consequence of previous wounds, and he received a state funeral.
The nuance here is painful. A brilliant soldier, enmeshed in the machinery of a criminal state, treated as both martyr and scapegoat in a regime that brooked no dissent. Reflecting on this sequence, a raid at Dieppe, doctrinal change, deception, the build-up to Overlord, Rommel's efforts and his demise, we can see a recurring pattern in modern war. Tactical episodes ripple outward, changing minds and machines and contributing to decisions at the very top. Dieppe was a localized catastrophe and a forced curriculum in amphibious operations. The engineers and planners who digested its lessons did not merely innovate for the sake of innovation, they aimed to translate loss into fewer losses in the decisive assault to come. Deception, too, was not an abstract art. It was a strategic lever that changed the spatial calculus of enemy dispositions. And personalities mattered. Commanders like Rommel could bend local practice, shape debates in Berlin, and alter the texture of defense even if they could not ultimately dictate grand strategy. Yet these are not just words about machines and maps, they are inevitably stories about people. For thousands of young men in summer 1942, Dieppe was their first and last test in Europe. For families across Canada and Britain, it was a wound. For German soldiers, it was a warning and a confirmation that their coasts could be threatened in ways both massive and subtle. For Rommel, it was one of the inputs that converted a desert commander into a builder of fortifications, a man whose professional devotion to tactical detail would collide disastrously with the politics and economics of a failing state. What does all of this mean for how we remember courage and culpability? Rommel's legacy remains profoundly ambiguous. He was a clinician of systems and terrain, admired by some for military skill and criticized by others for serving a criminal regime. That contradiction cannot be resolved by rhetorical gestures. It must be held in the historian's uneasy balance. The raid at Dieppe exemplifies the same ambiguity. Valor on one hand, catastrophic cost on the other. A lesson learned that, if translated properly, helped save many lives in a later, even greater operation. War often forces such double edges upon us: bravery entangled with failure, innovation born of loss, moral agency constrained by the structures within which people operate. So what is the final shape of the story?
It is not a tidy moral parable. It is a braided human and material history. The pebble-strewn beach that produced an engineered response. The command room that turned mourning into doctrine. The coastal inspector who walked the sand and drew line after line to keep invasion at bay. And the planners who, learning the hard way, prepared a different kind of invasion, one that combines surprise, deception, and technology.
Diepp's lessons fed directly and indirectly into the tactics used in 1944. Mulberry Harbor's and Hobart's tanks rehearsed combined operations and endless deception campaigns that tied German attention where Allied planners wanted it. Rommel's last month show how even the most gifted commanders could be defeated by factors beyond the tactical: politics, production limitations, and the iron reality of strategic overreach. If there is a single image to end on, it is both small and absurdly large, a tide that laps pebbles once and then forever changes the contours of planning on both sides of the channel. The men who landed at Dieppe forced engineers to sketch new designs, forced intelligence services to refine their arts, and forced commanders to take more sophisticated chances. And in the moral fog that war generates, they remind us that history is made in moments of courage and catastrophe combined. That is why decades on we still come back to that cold August morning, not to revel in disaster, but to study how the hard, costly lessons of failure can be transformed into the complex apparatus of later success, and how the people who inhabit that apparatus are shaped by duty, conscience, and circumstance. For Erwin Rommel, for the planners in London, for the soldiers on the beach, the raid was not an isolated episode, but a pivot. It helped to rewrite amphibious warfare. It sharpened the deceptions that would hide Overlord, and it contributed in uncertain ways to the chain of events that ended with the Allied landings in 1944 and Rommel's tragic removal from command. If you want to go deeper into the planning and machines that followed Dieppe, the funnies, the mulberries, and the deception networks that fooled German high command, watch our extended breakdown linked in the description. For now, remember this: history's most consequential operations often begin with the smallest, most human experiments, and sometimes the cost of those experiments reshapes the very world they sought to change.